F1's next era is just a few years away and will kick off with 6 engine manufacturers for the first time in nearly 2 decades, but McLaren will not be one of the works teams. The 2026 rules are the logical endpoint for McLaren's ongoing long-term overhaul that's meant to re-establish the team as a title contender. But it's set to have a locked-in disadvantage for that generation of F1 car because of its own decisions and the moves made by rival teams. One of F1's big goals for 2026 was to bring in new engine manufacturers, and that's been a success. While Red Bull Powertrains has only been created because we all thought Honda would be quitting F1, Audi's new works team is a huge catch, and Honda's coming back after all, citing the new rules as the main reason for doing so. Not since 2008, when there were engines from Ferrari, BMW, Honda, Mercedes, Renault and Toyota, has F1 had as many manufacturers involved as it will in 2026. The 2026 manufacturers will all be represented by works teams. Ferrari, Mercedes, Alpine and Red Bull Racing speak for themselves, while Audi is in the process of taking over Sauber and Honda will partner exclusively with Aston Martin. McLaren's had discussions with most of those manufacturers but will now be one of a few customer teams instead. Sticking with Mercedes now looks like McLaren's most likely action because, with all respect to Ferrari and Renault, McLaren's not wasting its time switching its customer allegiance for what would be the 3rd time in 8 years. And Red Bull might well produce a great F1 engine with Ford, but it's this operation's first crack at a power unit, and there are 2 Red Bull teams that would be ahead of McLaren in the queue. So even though McLaren Racing CEO Zak Brown visited Red Bull Powertrains in the winter, this was really a non-starter. But we'll get into McLaren and Mercedes later on. First, let's understand the nailed-on 2026 works engine prospects that McLaren has missed out on, Audi and Honda. It's well established that Audi was interested in buying into McLaren before it ultimately settled for Sauber. McLaren could have been the Audi works team from 2026 onwards as part of a blockbuster combination, but it was only possible if McLaren sold part of the team, which it wasn't willing to entertain. It explored other options over the winter too. As we reported back at the start of the year, McLaren had initial contact with Honda over a potential reunion. This always sounded somewhat unlikely and just reflected Brown's desire to consider all options. Brown was part of the McLaren hierarchy that Honda fell out with in 2017, and some scars run deep. The bigger problem though was Honda would only be tempted into an F1 project on the right terms. With a vast fortune behind it, the Aston Martin program was both willing and able to help underwrite the cost of getting Honda to stop dithering and commit to a 2026 engine. We can safely assume that didn't go for McLaren, especially as its last Honda deal involved Honda paying McLaren a massive sum, not the other way around. And that's why the second of the 2 best chances for a works engine supply for 2026 failed to amount to anything. Beyond the confirmed manufacturers for 2026, there was another contender, Porsche. Porsche ended its formal evaluation of an F1 program this year, despite the championship still being of interest. Until pretty recently, it was still possible it would be a late addition to the 2026 party. The VW Group-owned manufacturer wanted to enter F1 alongside sister brand Audi as part of the new engine rules, but talks with Red Bull and, yes, McLaren collapsed because Porsche wanted to buy either a significant or controlling stake. Porsche still retains an interest in F1, but it will not have an entry or affiliation with a team in the medium term, and although the end of a formal evaluation doesn't preclude resuming the search for a partner team in the future, it will be after 2026 if it happens at all. Porsche's Red Bull discussions were its most high-profile effort to get on the grid, but ultimately failed because of Porsche's greed and the fact Red Bull created a new powertrains division to build its first ever in-house F1 engine, so is in a great negotiating position. It's also been reported that Porsche had reasonably advanced discussions with Aston Martin for what would have been the partnership that Honda has ultimately landed. But according to German publication Automotor und Sport, Porsche couldn't meet Aston Martin's timeline for a decision and wanted more than what Honda was willing to settle for. As far as Red Bull and Aston Martin were concerned, each had its own alternative path to being a works team with its own engine. In Red Bull's case, it was an in-house project, while Aston Martin did what was needed to get Honda to commit. McLaren didn't have such leverage, so why say no to Porsche? That partnership existed to great effect in the past after all, as McLaren won titles in the mid-1980s with engines that were branded TAG but built by Porsche. Well, it's ultimately the same situation that led McLaren to say no to Audi. Based on what Audi's done with Sauber, taking charge of 75% of the company by 2026, we can assume Audi would have wanted a significant minority stake or an outright majority at McLaren too. And we know that Porsche wanted to buy half of Red Bull, so it would want the same or similar from McLaren. but McLaren wasn't willing to cede that much control in return for being a works team. It backs itself to achieve its goals in F1 as a customer, and it doesn't want to be at the mercy of the board of an automotive manufacturer. Plus, selling would mean the existing shareholders lose a chunk of their assets, and with F1 teams, including McLaren, becoming profit-making entities, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Cynical though it may sound, financially it's better to own the majority of a midfield F1 team than be a minority partner in a more successful one. Especially when McLaren shareholders have invested heavily in recent years, sticking by the team through major setbacks like ending its lucrative Honda deal in 2017 and the automotive company hitting financial difficulties, especially around the COVID-19 pandemic. All of this leaves McLaren looking at a long-term engine future that's the same as it has now, a Mercedes customer arrangement. McLaren is 3 years into its second spell as a Mercedes team, having recovered from the difficulties of its Honda partnership and a 3-year interim stint as a Renault customer. This has been a valuable reunion for McLaren. It's injected some much needed technical consistency, and the Mercedes Works team has given McLaren a clear benchmark. But for McLaren's long-term progress, a Works engine supply would be ideal. There's no pretending otherwise, and McLaren team principal Andrea Stella admits that this would be the priority. For various reasons though, it hasn't been possible, at least not on terms that McLaren considers worthwhile. McLaren basically sees the options in 3 levels. The top one is a proper works engine, the middle one is a customer engine from an established and competitive manufacturer, and the last is a works engine from a completely new manufacturer. Clearly McLaren's got no interest in being a customer for an incoming supplier. The reason a new manufacturer is allegedly at the bottom of that priority list is the risk of a potentially uncompetitive engine or a project that would need a couple of years to come to full fruition. McLaren wants to build a race-winning F1 car for 2026 and doesn't want to take any chances that this will be undermined by the engine. It might be a stretch to say it fears a Honda repeat, but that will definitely have informed its thinking. If you buy into that logic, you can see why McLaren would have been hesitant at going with Porsche or Audi on unfavourable terms. Whether it's the control of the team, naming rights, financial recompense, what McLaren would have to give up was not considered worth the risk. Especially as McLaren knows it still has to do a better job as a customer. It's not as if it's currently banging against a glass ceiling in terms of performance. So if the best alternative is a customer deal, then sticking with Mercedes makes sense. It has a well-established, good working relationship with an organisation that is well equipped to supply multiple teams and has a ton of experience in doing exactly that. It's a low-risk choice with a good chance of being competitive enough to at least fight for wins. In the circumstances, the appeal is obvious, and there are so many unknowns at the moment about F1's next era that we can't say whether this will or will not work for McLaren. But among all the teams with big ambitions for F1's next era, McLaren is the odd one out. Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, Audi and Alpine will all have their own works engines, and no team has won a title in the V6 turbo hybrid era as an engine customer. The last time that happened at all was in 2013, when Red Bull was still the de facto Renault works team. Whatever the logic, it makes this arrangement a competitive risk. If it fails, if Audi's works team is a better overall package for example, then McLaren's backers will need to live with the choice of owning more of a less successful team than less of a more successful one, and its employees and even drivers may start to wonder what ceiling has been imposed on its performance. McLaren probably made the best choice it could while deciding its future on its own terms, but it will need to be an exception to a clear-cut modern F1 rule if it is to succeed.